When you think of a robust LGBTQ community, Utah might not be at the top of your list.
In fact, it might not be a place you think of as being LGBTQ friendly at all. One of our friends in California thought so too.
My name's Alex Yan, and I'm 24.
So, Alex, when you hear Utah, what's like the main thought that pops into your mind about the state?
Beautiful, I'd say fairly conservative. Definitely Provo is what I kind of think of immediately.
Would you ever consider moving to Utah?
No. I don't think it's a place for me, to be fully honest.
Can I ask why?
I guess, I just, am a person who likes living on, the coast, I guess. And then, I'm queer and trans, and I don't think sometimes I just don't think I'd find, I'm sure I could find community there. I think it would just be, harder to do so, if that makes sense.
There is truth there. There are people in the community who are marginalized, and recent legislation targeting trans youth has put Utah back in national headlines. But LGBTQ acceptance in the state has also come a long way, and that goes for places like urban Salt Lake County and rural Carbon County. I'm Sean Higgins.
And I'm Sage Miller. This week on State Street, we're diving into the robust history of the LGBTQ community that calls Utah home.
Is Utah really as anti-LGBTQ as its reputation would have some insiders and outsiders believe? It definitely wasn't always sunshine and rainbows. And that's a common history Utah shares with many other states when it comes to LGBTQ issues.
But we're taking a look at how far Utah has come over the years and where it's going next.
Okay, we'll just get this out of the way. Utah isn't known for being an LGBTQ oasis like San Francisco or New York City.
In last week's episode, we heard that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is pretty strict when it comes to where they stand on LGBTQ issues. It says, in no uncertain terms, marriage should be between one man and one woman.
And that sentiment is a big part of how the state has approached those issues in the past.
Utah definitely has a history of policies that have harmed the community.
Like the state neglecting to set aside money to fight the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s.
Or when the Salt Lake City School Board voted in 1995 to ban all extracurricular clubs because a 17-year-old wanted to start a gay-straight alliance at East High School.
Yep, that's the same school made famous by High School Musical 11 years later.
The ban remained until 2000, after a lawsuit pressured the school board to back down. It worked, and all extracurricular school activities resumed.
Utah also passed a constitutional amendment in 2004 that defined marriage as only between one man and one woman.
66% of Utahns voted for the measure.
Former Republican State Senator Chris Butters was a co-sponsor of the amendment. Right after it passed in 2004, Butters appeared on KUER's Radio West.
You know, the gays and lesbians feel they're under attack. They're not under attack. They're on the offense attacking, saying we need to have recognition as marriage. I disagree with that. If they want to make a choice and have relationships between same sex and all these other things, that's their choice. I don't agree with it. We're not fighting that. All we're saying is don't expect us to change the legal definition of marriage to accommodate those choices.
And the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints poured loads of money into Proposition 8. That was the 2008 ballot initiative in California to constitutionally ban same-sex marriage. And it worked. The proposition passed, but was later overturned by a federal court. Then the United States Supreme Court ruled same-sex marriage as constitutional in 2015.
With that said, Utah has played a substantial role in the constitutional right for same-sex couples to get hitched legally, too.
To hash out Utah's treatment and progression of the LGBTQ community, we turn to someone who studies it. I spoke with J. Seth Anderson. He's an independent historian and spent part of his youth in Utah. He wrote a book called LGBT Salt Lake, a history about the community in Utah. Anderson and his husband Michael actually became a part of Utah LGBTQ history themselves. The story starts a few years before the SCOTUS ruling.
Michael and I were the first to get married in Utah in this kind of weird way. It's December 2013. Michael and I are both in graduate school. It was right after the semester had ended, I think, and our friend Paul, who's an attorney in Salt Lake, calls. And I'm busy doing my work and whatever, and Paul calls and I ignore it. He calls again and I ignore it. He calls again and I ignored it. And then he called Michael. And I was like, oh, okay, Paul is trying to get a hold of us. I think something's going on. So I called him back and he said, oh my God, Judge Shelby ruled today, December 20th. Nobody expected this. We thought this ruling was going to come in January. But also, the state has no legal right to forbid you from getting married. So he basically struck down Amendment 3, which had been passed by the voters in 2004. Same-sex marriage is legal in Utah. So Michael and I looked at each other and we're like, oh my God, are we going to get married right now? So we jump in the car, we rush down to State Street and 21st where the county building is. We get there. I think that everybody knows and that we're going to get inside the room and there's going to be a line and it's just going to be chaos. We finally get up there, we fling open the doors, and it's like radio silent. Nobody has heard the news. There's like a couple there to get a passport. I think there was another straight couple there to get a marriage license. And so we rush in and we're like, hi, we're here to get a marriage license. And the woman was super nice and she leaned forward across the desk and she said, there's nothing more that I would like than to give you a marriage license. But the state, doesn't allow it. And I said, no, actually, look. And I held up my phone. Paul had sent me the text of the ruling. And I was like, look, the judge ruled on the case, like it's legal. And she gasped. She went, and then she said, I need to talk to somebody. And she said, just hang on. So we're standing there kind of pacing around. And then I start tweeting about it. I'm like, oh my God, we're down here at the courthouse. We're going to get married. By that point, the news was there. So we came out and there's just this wall of media. And so we start just doing interviews. And that was December 20th, 2013. We're coming up on 10 years. Another one of those like trivia history questions, right? Like Utah was actually one of the first, which is kind of cool. Michael and I will have been married for 10 years in December.
So it was a monumental moment. What did that mean to you?
As a young kid in the 80s and as a teenager in the 90s, the idea that I would ever be married never crossed my mind. I wanted to get married because I value marriage. I think it is a valuable institution. It's a huge responsibility that gay lesbian people wanted for so long. Not to destroy marriage, but because we valued it.
So you grew up in Utah. How did you view the LGBT community in your youth?
I was a little kid in the late 80s, and so I really came of age. I was a teenager in the late 90s. It wasn't anything that was talked about. The 80s was the time of AIDS. The 80s was a very scary time, and I am not of that AIDS generation. I am below it, so I didn't ever have friends who died from AIDS. Into the 90s is when things changed. So the early to mid 90s, the gay rights movement has found some political footing and it's becoming more visible and more politically powerful.
However, when we look at Utah, you give examples in your book of opposition that the community faced, like the state not allocating any money to the AIDS epidemic or banning all after-school clubs in 95 following the creation of the first gay-straight alliance at East High School. So why was there such fierce opposition to this community?
I think partly it's the focus on family that the church really began to emphasize beginning in the 60s, 70s. The idea that like marriage between a man and a woman is central to creating eternal families. They really bought into a dominant cultural idea that emerged from American universities in the 1940s and 50s about homosexuality as a mental illness. So they kind of vacillate between this idea of it's a sin, it's a mental illness, and if it's a mental illness, it isn't really a sin. The church really never has an explanation where or why homosexuality exists. But they're definitely seeing it as a trial that one has to overcome so that when AIDS happens in the 80s, they don't say this, but I can see from their perspective how they're like, yeah, we told you for the last decade, stop doing that. Like, this is going to have negative consequences. But the church does what most people in the country do. They're very afraid and they don't know how to respond.
So how did the growing of the LGBT community in Utah, even in the 90s, even in the 80s, respond to these laws and stereotypes against them?
It was a tough time nationally and in Utah. But it was really just the community itself relying on itself to fundraise and to create spaces and to create communities of care for the people who were dying. The 90s, it changes a little bit because of the political organizing that happens. In Utah, David K. Nelson gets the Democratic Party to adopt what I will call a pro-gay platform. It's not like that they embrace it immediately. It's kind of a struggle, but they do. They helped pass the first non-discrimination laws in Utah. There's people elected to the Salt Lake County Council who are supported by gay, lesbian Utah Democrats. Gay, lesbian people start to make their voice heard at the local level, culminating with the election of Jackie Biskupski in a 98. She's the first openly gay person elected to the state house. In the 90s, then, there's more confidence in coming out. The legal heft behind you is kind of on your side. And the way that they're advocating for themselves is through debate, going into places where, there may be not gay-friendly people and engaging them in conversations. They're not burning down buildings or like having freakouts on the street. They're actually doing this grunt work, this hard work of political activism to change minds, to change hearts, to be themselves. And they are tremendously successful in it.
In your book, you describe a queer new world in Utah after these historic passages, like recognizing same-sex marriage in a state that fought very hard against it. What do you mean by a queer new world?
We are in a totally new social, cultural moment. As is what happens with every generation, the social climate changes, ideas change. I've even met young Latter-day Saints here in Boston and my nieces and nephews in Utah who don't care about, it's so uninteresting to them. They just live in this world where gay people are present and gay lesbian people hold positions of power and authority. They get married, they have families, they are professors, they are doctors, they are your friends, they are teachers, they are stay-at-home. They're just, it's so common and so normal. It's just been so refreshing to me to talk to these 18-year-olds who literally don't care. Active LDS kids who are 18 who are oh, you're married, that's great, awesome, cool. Anyway, it's moving on. Why are we talking about it?
Knowing what you know and experiencing what you've experienced, would you consider Utah a safe and welcoming place for members of the LGBTQ community to live in?
A bazillion %. The only places I have ever experienced any kind of anti-gay discrimination on the street has been in New York, Los Angeles, and downtown Phoenix. But in New York, it certainly was, I felt threatened. I've never felt that way in Utah. Michael and I walked around town holding hands all the time. No one ever said anything. Members of the church, they might not be politically supportive or thrilled with that kind of visibility, but they're not going to throw a brick through your window. I love Salt Lake. It's my heart is in Salt Lake. I would move back there or to Phoenix tomorrow if I could. And I will someday. I don't know when. If you were at a time machine and somebody said, where do you want to live? You would pick to live as a gay person in Utah in the year 2023 and nowhere else. For real.
That was J. Seth Anderson, the author of LGBT Salt Lake.
After the break, we'll speak with the owner of the queerest barbershop in Utah and how she left Salt Lake County for Carbon County.
You're listening to State Street.
Support for State Street comes from the Hinckley Report podcast, a weekly roundtable discussion about the biggest political headlines in the Beehive State. Find new episodes of PBS Utah's The Hinckley Report every Friday, wherever you listen to podcasts.
Welcome back to State Street. I'm Sean Higgins.
And I'm Sage Miller. We just heard from historian J. Seth Anderson about how the LGBT community heightened its visibility in a place it wasn't always welcome.
Despite political leaders pushing back against the progression of LGBTQ rights, Utah actually led the way in some areas, like same-sex marriage.
And members of the LGBTQ community also did a lot to advocate for their rights, despite obstacles from state leaders and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They organized, filed lawsuits, won lawsuits, and overall refused to go unnoticed. The visibility made a difference, and it made Utah a more accepting place for people who identify as LGBTQ.
The national advocacy group The Human Rights Campaign shows Utah has a good amount of LGBTQ protections on the books. Salt Lake City even has a perfect score in its 2022 Municipality Equality Scorecard. But the state's report card does ding Utah for policies like limiting LGBTQ topics in school. Now, that visibility extends beyond the urban hubs along the Wasatch Front.
Kylie Howell is the owner of Friar Tuck's Barbershop. The shop first opened its doors in Salt Lake County in 2016, and it soon became an affirming space for LGBTQ residents.
Howell told us people were driving from all over Utah to get a haircut at Friar Tuck's. To her knowledge, it was the only place where people of all sexualities and gender identities felt comfortable asking for the haircut they wanted without judgment.
It's what inspired her to dub Friar Tuck's as the queerest barbershop in Utah.
But then,
Helper, Utah came calling. The little Carbon County city most people only stop in for gas on their way to Moab. Population, just over 2,000.
it's a rural city where you wouldn't expect the queerest barbershop in Utah to open a storefront, but Friar Tuck's did. That means it's road trip time.
I grew up in Carbon County. I grew up in Price. Both sets of my grandparents lived in East Carbon, and I spent a lot of time at my grandparents' house. So I opened Friar Tuck's Barbershop in early 2016. My first location was sort of in the Glendale area, like off of Redwood Road and 4th South. I was there for about a year and a half, and then I moved to a different spot in Salt Lake and was there for about 5 years. I actually just closed the doors on that space like 2 weeks ago. But 2 years ago, I moved to Helper, Utah, close to where I'm from, and opened a location on Main Street.
Why Helper?
So living in Salt Lake, I mean, honestly, it was getting super, super expensive. And one time, it was like January 2021, we were driving back to Salt Lake from Grand Junction, and we were driving through, and I usually didn't stop in Carbon County unless I really, really needed to, and certainly not in Helper. But I just had been like hearing talk about like, oh, there's stuff going on in Helper, and like, it's really cute. I was like, what is it that's going on in Helper? Like, let's go see. So we got off the exit and drove down Helper Main Street, and there's shops open and there's people walking around the streets and like life happening. So we spent a couple of months like staying down here, a couple of weekends here and there, and like, yeah, then just started looking at houses, and it was never a question like, of course I was going to open a barbershop here.
When you hop onto the website, it says Utah's queerest barbershop. How did that come to be?
Through barber school, I dealt with a lot of misogyny, and immediately after barber school, I had been kicked out of barber shops, being told like, we don't cut women's hair. I had gotten a lot of pushback about the kind of haircut that I wanted when I would go to places, and I just really wasn't like finding a space that catered to gender fluidity, honestly. In 2016 in Salt Lake, that just really didn't exist. And in 2017, I was featured in a Dove commercial that was, the campaign was about real beauty and how that can sort of look different than what you might automatically think when you think beauty. And that really kind of sparked this movement and realizing like, oh, I'm not the only one that's having a hard time finding somebody that would do the haircut that I wanted and kind of not push back on me about it and actually really encourage me and empower me. And after a while, like I was kind of looking at my clientele and realizing like we are like 95% queer on some end of the spectrum. And that was really awesome to see that sort of like organically grow. I didn't intend to open as a super queer barbershop. And I'll say like, you know, I kind of declared myself as Utah's queerest barbershop, and somebody told me like, wow, that's kind of a bold claim, like Utah's queerest barbershop. And I'm like, I would love if somebody wanted to stand up and be like, no, actually my barbershop is more queer. I would love that. Now, there are a few definitely like queer oriented barbershops, like owned, operated by queer folks, and very invested in creating a space for the LGBTQ plus community.
What was the community response to having Utah's queerest barbershop in little old Helper, Utah?
Honestly, the community has been great. The reception has been great. The queer need here wasn't as, the demand wasn't as high at first. And so it didn't start out as like, I mean, I've always had the rainbow flag flying and, you know, but it wasn't this like, hey, queers of Carbon County, like, come on down, because I wasn't really aware that like there were so many of us. I knew we were here, but I did not realize we were here. And the reception has been great from, you know, everybody. I will say like there's definitely been a lot more conversation here in and around like, why do you have the rainbow flag hanging up like that? Like, I've had folks tell me like they feel like it means they're not welcome here because they're straight. And obviously that's not something I want to hear, but I'm really grateful to be able to have that conversation. And honestly, I think in Salt Lake, I was kind of in this vacuum of not ever having those conversations. And I'm not looking to like make anybody believe a way that they don't believe or like go against their own, morals and ethics. I'm just trying to show people like queer people are just people. We're here now. We've always been here. Nobody's hiding in the shadows, like out to get you or anything like that. But like we deserve to exist in all of the spaces that we choose to exist. And that includes rural spaces.
You had this mental shift from not belonging in a place like Carmen County to recognizing that this was your home. Describe the feeling when you had that acknowledgement.
Yeah, honestly, when that happened, I was up at the top of the hill up in Kenilworth. I had parked my car and we just kind of got out. It was so quiet and we were just kind of like looking over the valley. And I was looking out at the Book Cliffs. And when I was younger, I hated the Book Cliffs. And here's the thing, I don't think I really did, because I would go adventure in them and I had so much fun and I had so many good memories built on that. But like when we would drive like from Price to East Carbon to go see my grandparents, I would just be like, oh, like the landscape here is terrible and it's just a bunch of like tan hills and I hate it here. And I think that was like a defense mechanism because I really had resolved in myself that I didn't belong here and I was going to have to eventually leave. And like, I think maybe my tiny little undeveloped brain was in survival mode of like, don't love this place because you're not going to be able to be here. And I'm probably going to cry now. Being at the top of that mountain and like looking out, there was like this dusting of snow on the Book Cliffs. It was so beautiful. And I was like looking at them and I felt almost apologetic for how I had felt about it in my youth. And I think that was honestly the moment, like I felt peaceful, but honestly like I felt at home.
That was Kylie Howell, the owner of Friar Tuck's Barbershop in Helper, Utah.
So what does all of this mean for the LGBTQ community in Utah? And is the state really a harmful place for queer people, as its reputation might make you think?
Utah hasn't always been a champion of LGBTQ rights. History shows it worked against them in a lot of ways.
But the narrative has changed. The topic of LGBTQ inclusion isn't as divisive as it once was. In the face of resistance, LGBTQ Utahns fought for their rights and, in a lot of cases, prevailed.
The majority of Utah's federal delegation voted to protect same-sex marriage this year. And Equality Utah and the Utah Eagle Forum, two lobbying groups on polar opposites of the political spectrum, worked together to ensure conversion therapy was banned at the state level. The law passed this legislative session.
But it's worth noting one area that's seen more pushback recently. While Utah may be more tolerant of diverse sexual orientations, state lawmakers have been pushing for restrictions related to transgender youth. Sexual orientation is different from gender identity. Who you're attracted to is not always related to how you experience gender.
That's right. Gender identity is a whole new landscape for a lot of people. And the Utah legislature voted this year to ban trans youth from accessing medical treatment like hormone therapy and gender-affirming care.
Lawmakers also passed legislation prohibiting trans youth from participating in school sports in 2022, but that law is currently blocked by the courts.
Overall, Utah is a place and has always been a place that LGBTQ people call home.
The state has enshrined some LGBTQ rights.
But it took a long time for the state to come around to sexual orientation, and it might be a while before the same can be said for trans and gender nonconforming issues. So it is a better place for a lot of LGBTQ Utahns, but not for everybody right now. I'm Sage Miller.
And I'm Sean Higgins. The show's executive producer is Caroline Ballard. Editing and production support comes from David Childs and KUER news director Elaine Clark.
Our digital team includes Jim Hill, Eleanor Gomberg, and Raquel Davis. A special thanks to Bijan Siavoshi, who gathered audio for us in California.
State Street is a production of KUER. Just can't get enough of the show? Sign up for our newsletter for behind-the-scenes content. And we'd love to hear what you think. Leave us a review wherever you're listening. See you next week. Does your barbershop have one of those things they do your shoulders with?
What? Yeah, we pay $90 for a haircut and don't get a shoulder massage.
From KUER.